Hey everybody, this is Emily Knight with the Lenfest Ocean Program. Welcome to one of our latest webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who do not know the Lenfest Ocean Program, we are a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address needs facing decision makers and stakeholders. To learn more, visit us at lenfestocean.org, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us at Lenfest Ocean on Twitter. In fact, for this webinar, we will also be live tweeting it on the hashtag HillWebinar, so feel free to use that too if you are so inclined and engage with us online. So today we have Dr. Tessa Hill, a professor at University of California, Davis, along with other members of the research team, which I will let her introduce, to discuss their new project, Developing Insights for Decision-Making on Changing Ocean Chemistry on the West Coast. This is what we at Lenfest like to call a launch webinar. That is a webinar as the work is just getting started to announce the project and engage from the beginning many audiences of managers, policymakers, and stakeholders. So what you'll be hearing from our presenters is an overview of the scientific and decision-making context for their project, the work they aim to conduct over the next couple of years, and their initial plans to engage decision makers and stakeholders to ensure the work is useful and informative throughout the life of the project. It is also our goal to share information on the progress of the project via a variety of avenues. First, I've created a running distribution list for anyone interested in engaging on the project or just following along. If you are not on that or unsure if you are, just send me a note. My email is up on the introductory slide in front of you. Second, we are recording this webinar and will distribute the link broadly. Before I turn it over to Tessa, just a few webinar logistics. We have all attendees muted with so many people on the line. This is just to prevent feedback. We will also have time at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A panel to type and submit your question at any point during the webinar. We will keep track of the queue, and I will read it aloud at the end for the researchers to answer. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get to them all, but folks are welcome to follow up with us, and we will keep track of all of the questions asked and share them with the researchers. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Tessa. So Tessa, I'm about to transfer presenter privileges to you.
Thank you, Emily.
All right, here we go.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of those transitions planned within the webinar, so bear with us as we move from one speaker to another. I'm assuming you can all hear me and see me, or see my slides, and Emily will tell me if that's not the case. So I want to thank you all for joining us. And as Emily indicated, the first thing I'd like to do is just introduce you to the research team that is working on this new project that we're going to tell you about today. The team is big because this project is complex and interdisciplinary. And so you can see here that there are scientists and experts across 4 different institutions, including graduate students and postdocs that are working on this project. And what I'd like to do is actually take sort of a next step to make this slightly less complex and tell you about who you're going to hear from today, because obviously you're not going to hear from this full team today. So today you'll hear from 3 of us that represent different aspects of the project that are interconnected. I'm here on the left, Tessa Hill at UC Davis. You will also hear from Jessica Kauser, a science officer at the California Ocean Science Trust, and Dr. Anna Spalding, an assistant professor at Oregon State University. As Emily indicated, this is really the start of a project. We're not reporting results today. We're telling you about the context of what we have planned and gathering your feedback. We have been thrilled to work with the Lenfest Ocean Program because one of the things that we enjoyed doing with them from the very beginning is thinking about the decision-making context of this science at the outset, from the design and the development of the project. We also, as we were brainstorming this project, we engaged with federal and state agencies, conservation organizations, and the sustainable aquaculture industry to develop the project ideas and think about how they might use the data that we are looking at. We continue to seek that kind of feedback and engagement from decision makers and stakeholders and from all of you. And so that's really a big part of what this webinar is about today. We're really grateful for the support of the Lenfest Ocean Program, and I also want to mention that this project links to a project supported by the California Ocean Protection Council. That project, which we've also started on with our same research team, focuses more on nearshore and estuarine species in California. And so as you hear us talking today, if you're wondering why we're not speaking about species inside of estuaries, it's because of its, we're basically working on that within that California Ocean Protection Council project. We see these projects as linked and complementary and even synergistic with each other. So as depicted in this figure from the California Climate Assessment, we're trying to both study and manage a rapidly changing ocean. This research project focuses on some of these changes as they overlap, in particular the chemical ones at the bottom lower left of the image, pH, hypoxia, changes in carbon dioxide, and temperature. We look at that in the context of knowing that many other things are changing at the same time. You may hear us or see us refer to these processes as OAH, ocean acidification and hypoxia, OAH for short. This has become sort of the West Coast shorthand for thinking about these overlapping multi-stressors, but we're going to work hard to not slip into that shorthand and actually explain all of the complex pieces that we're trying to put together here. This project was fundamentally inspired by two central ideas. The first is that we're working with a highly variable oceanographic landscape and also an exciting decision-making landscape, and you'll hear about both of those aspects today. To start with the oceanographic landscape, I included this image. This was published in a paper in 2016, and it's from an effort to overlay 3 data sets, really a snapshot of time of a spring time period along the West Coast and thinking about where low pH pools of water were showing up along the coast at this time. We overlaid only 3 data sets and in this particular study, and yet we're sort of struck by the complexity and the variability in the mosaic of pH along our coast. And it made us think that there might be an ability to hone in on where and when species are vulnerable. This might be useful for managers trying to target actions around these processes. And it also made us think, well, what if we even made this a little bit more complicated? What if we overlay more data sets or consider it in a multiple stressor approach where we aren't just thinking about pH? So then the other piece I told you that we were inspired by was an exciting decision-making landscape. And so at this point, I'm going to have Jess actually take over. I'm going to attempt to do her slides for her, but you're going to hear her voice for a little bit on the next couple slides.
Great. Thanks, Tessa. So as Tessa said, my name is Jessica Kauser, and I'm a science officer at the Ocean Science Trust. And we'll be working very closely with Anna Spalding, who is a professor of marine and coastal policy at Oregon State University. So what I'm going to do here is just briefly introduce our role in this project and then outline the decision-making context related to ocean acidification as part of the impetus for this project along the West Coast. So just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with Ocean Science Trust, We are a California-based nonprofit created by state legislation and staffed by a small team of science to policy experts. So we work statewide and collaborate with scientists and policy leaders across the West Coast and nationally to bridge the gap between managers, scientists, and stakeholders to bring together cutting-edge science and sound ocean management. We also serve as the science advisor to the California Ocean Protection Council, which is a cabinet-level state policy body and serves as the California governor's advisor on coastal and ocean policy. So through these roles, we work on a wide variety of topics from fisheries to climate change and ocean acidification. So on this project, we will be working with Anna Spalding from OSU to design 2 workshops and engagement efforts to build a shared understanding of the proposed research, shape the research outputs to be tailored to decision-maker needs, and build buy-in and readiness to take up and use these research results. And we'll kind of dive into a little bit more about how we're going to do that in a bit. But as many of you likely know, ocean acidification is a complex topic and one that has been a challenge for decision makers to identify how to best approach actions and potential solutions. So in development of this project, as Tessa mentioned, considering the decision-making context has been a really critical component to ensure this work's usefulness. So for example, how spatial analyses like this might be conducted to frame where aquaculture activities might take place, or using vulnerability data in commercial and recreational fisheries management and recovery plans, or how one might monitor indicator species based on spatial data about where ocean acidification, hypoxia impacts may occur. So to date, as Tessa alluded to, we have coordinated with and received feedback from a breadth of perspectives. And so here we will focus on the specific OA, I was going to slip into acronyms, ocean acidification and hypoxia milestones across the U.S. West Coast that are informing our thinking going forward as we've explored it so far. So to just say up front, we have likely not yet identified all the potential opportunities for uptake of this work and want to engage with all of you to make sure that that is the most comprehensive. So while we're currently focusing on mostly state-level actions as we go through this presentation and where we see potential benefits for this research, we acknowledge that there are likely lots of other places and different decision levels in which this information would be useful, and look forward to really engaging more with you all to bolster what these decision points might be. So diving in, OA has already been seen to cause issues along the West Coast. Recognizing the risks of ocean acidification, Washington Governor Christine Gregoire created the Washington State Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification in 2012 to chart a new course for addressing the causes and consequences of acidification. So this panel identified actions that would increase Washington's capacity to understand, reduce, remediate, and where possible, adapt to the consequences of ocean acidification and changing conditions. So then in 2013, the Ocean Science Trust, along with the Ocean Protection Council, also responded to growing interest and concern about ocean acidification by convening the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Science Panel, which was a group of ocean acidification experts from across the West Coast and British Columbia. And the panel's work identified tangible strategic actions that California, Oregon, and Washington could make to prepare for this significant threat. And then on the international front, these panels' efforts led to the International OA Alliance in 2016, calling for members to develop action plans around ocean acidification and hypoxia. And so all 3 of the West Coast states, California, Oregon, and Washington, are members of this alliance and have developed action plans, with Oregon's action plan actually was just released earlier this month. So we will dive into some of those specific action plan priorities a little bit later in the webinar, but just wanted to highlight that while each action plan is different and specific to individual state needs, there are themes across that this work can our research can plug into to support decisions across all 3 states and beyond. So for example, looking across these 3 action plans, we saw common themes for needs for research, communication, and decision-maker action to address changing ocean conditions. And this may look a little different for each state, but overall, each action plan includes some steps to address each of these key themes. So our approach in this project is a bit novel because with Ocean Science Trust and Lenfest's involvement and support, we're able to bridge from research conducted and the communication of those results to actions to support this research being the most useful to the potential end users. And we see those potential end users for these action plans in this work. Our current thinking is that these would be living marine resource managers, so like Department of Fish and Wildlife, for example, or water quality, air quality managers, land-based legislature, and potentially industry as well. So while this is just how we're currently thinking about end users, we're, again, really looking forward to learning more from all of you and are open to other suggestions. So indeed, California, Oregon, and Washington operate as model systems for developing methods to combat ocean acidification and its affiliated stressors. So while there's momentum building along the West Coast states and much more understanding and receptivity to acting, exactly how to act is still kind of being worked out by decision makers. You know, for example, I understand the issue, but I kind of don't know where to start or what might be realistic given my management and policy reality. So funds and support of action plans and greenhouse gas emission strategies will need to be targeted wisely and strategically. So for example, how spatial information on ocean acidification can inform restoration efforts of things like seagrass beds or kelp forests, or spatial management like MPA efforts. So key to knowing where and how to act, or key to this momentum is knowing where and how to act. So although the West Coast states are at the forefront of working on these science-based tools to inform management, effective action is going to require knowing where to act and what policy or management responses can be expected to realize intended effects. So this project will target those localities where humans will be most impacted by ocean acidification, and showcasing this kind of geography of stress can help with the expansion of decision-maker scenarios to include agencies and, state coast-wide programs that can specifically address most affected communities. And just a quick note, while we're not explicitly studying community vulnerability to ocean acidification in this project, Anna Spalding is leading part of the related project that Tessa mentioned that is funded by the Ocean Protection Council to explore community vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So just throw out that Anna is happy to answer questions about that later, but it's exciting to be able to focus on 2 different parts of the human dimension of ocean acidification hypoxia. And indeed, this human dimension research piece, which might include vulnerability, adaptive capacity, perceptions, values and culture, decision-making, et cetera, is one that we're hoping will become more integrated over time to support success along the different decision points that we hope to identify in this project. So in short, growing understanding of where impacts will happen is key to implementing action. So this work aims to build on the momentum and growing receptivity to support and accelerate actions by identifying those locations that are prime for action by synthesizing the science, the research that Tessa will discuss momentarily. In addition to that, connecting early and often with end users, which is one of the goals of this work, will be identifying the most impactful and pragmatic solutions for use of this research. So I think with that, I will flip it back over to you, Tessa.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. So now we get to talk a little bit about the different aspects of the research project. And we have sort of 2 stated research goals, and then you'll see as I hand back off to Jess and Anna that we also have some goals around engaging with the decision-making and stakeholder community. So you can see the 2 research goals here on the screen, but we're going to hone in first on sort of the first question that we're looking at, thinking about these geospatial patterns of that very complex environment that I told you about earlier. So our goal here is to synthesize the wealth of data that have been collected over the past decade or even more to answer this question. A starting point is the excellent compilation of data that are featured on this website. This is an effort by the 3 West Coast states to build an inventory of monitoring efforts around ocean acidification and related ocean change. These were compiled and mapped by the states, and it's hosted on this website by OPC. And so we have this amazing starting place where we are able to look at a lot of different data sets that have been worked on and can be pulled into this synthesis. And I just want to give you a taste of the kinds of data that we intend to incorporate into this study. We've been gathering lists of data sets that are appropriate for this, and I'm not sharing a complete list here today, but just a few data types that we will be thinking about. The first are publicly hosted data, such as data sets from the excellent IUCE network. So we have this growing network of sensors along the U.S. West Coast that are part of the Integrated Ocean Observing System. Many of these are hosted at hatcheries or aquaculture facilities as part of the NOAA Ocean Acidification and IUCE Headlights project. We will be excited to incorporate data from these publicly hosted data sets. We will also pull in data sets from research cruises, for example, the Cal Coffee cruises in California, or in this case, what I'm showing you, the Access cruises that are a collaboration between the National Marine Sanctuaries and Point Blue. These types of data sets provide years to even decades of ocean environmental data that can be pulled into this synthesis. And here I'm just showing you an example of work being done on aragonite saturation state from these Access cruises to indicate sort of how corrosive those waters are to organisms trying to produce shells. There are also data sets that have been published that we can pull into this synthesis. Here I've just highlighted the longest time series in California that's been, and it is published data from the Mbari mooring. And so we can pull in these types of data sets that may not be publicly accessed but are in the scientific literature. And then, of course, we also have some data that we're contributing to this synthesis from our research team. And so just one or two examples of that. Here I'm showing you some data that we have internally from field work that was done over 5 years of time using 47 sites along the U.S. West Coast. And in this image, the blue colors indicate chemistry that is undersaturated or corrosive to organisms that are trying to build shells, and the red is less so. And what we can see in these data sets is variability both on the seasonal scale but also across latitude in terms of those chemical conditions. Along these similar lines, we are working with the National Park Service via a contract that will allow us to pull in National Park Service data into this data set, into this synthesis as well. So an outcome of all of this synthesis work will be a series of mapped data sets, like the map I showed you at the beginning of the webinar, but like I said, adding more layers of complexity and more data to those types of maps. And these are sort of our priorities in starting the project. We're going to focus on the time period where we have the most data density in both space and time. We'll be looking to look at year-to-year changes in that data set, but also mapping what we would consider normal oceanographic conditions as well as those that occurred during El Nino or marine heat waves. And we can also drill down a little bit and look at seasonal variability, and so shorter-term variability in temperature, pH, and hypoxia across this landscape. That builds a platform on which we then will think about how organisms are impacted by this stress. And so in question 2, we're looking at how culturally, commercially, and ecologically valuable species are vulnerable to those overlapping stressors that we've mapped in question 1. And we're approaching this in 2 ways. This work is being led by Christy Croker, who is not on the call today, so I'm going to do the best I can to convey our ecological approach here. The first is that we'll build upon those oceanographic maps that I just described to provide species-specific scenarios. To do so, we're going to target a suite of species and gather all the information that we can about their response to these multiple stressors. We'll then be able to compile maps that express the stress for that species. We'll do those in scenarios. For example, considering the cumulative effect of stressors, just simply adding those stressors together, as well as synergistic effects where stressors may actually layer on top of each other in less predictable manner. We actually have received lots of suggestions about the species that might be of the most interest, but we are still seeking feedback about that, and we're looking for a balance between species that are of significant interest, again, culturally, commercially, or ecologically, we need actually available knowledge about those species. And so we're aware that there are some species of great interest where there are actually knowledge gaps, that it would be pretty hard to make a species-specific map. And so that actually sort of brings us to the second part of this question, which is that we're going to do a deeper dive into a species of particular interest, Dungeness crab. This is a species of a lot of focus in the scientific community and of great management interest as well. And so it's a great sort of case study for us to take a deeper dive into. In this case, we aim to actually fill research gaps with laboratory experiments, specifically looking at multi-stressor impacts on juvenile crabs. Again, Christy Croker will be leading this, and the experiments will take place at UC Santa Cruz. And she's doing so in collaboration with others on the West Coast with ongoing interest in Dungeness crab. Outcomes of this part of the project will feed directly back into the step that I just described, refining the stress map for the Dungeness crab. We are aware of and excited about other ongoing work that's relevant to this study that we're describing. I've listed a few research groups here that we're excited to collaborate with. We are open to other collaborations too. So if you're listening in and you have a project that would be conducive to work together on, we'd love to hear from you. So now I'm actually going to switch off and have Jess and Anna
Great. Let's see. So I am assuming everybody can now hear me again and see these slides. And again, I'm sure Emily will tell me if that's otherwise.
You can.
So yeah.
Go ahead.
Great. So moving from, kind of the research that Tessa was just describing back into a bit more of the decision context and communication of this work. While the West Coast states all share a California current and, like we said, there are similarities across all of these action plans, there are individual management and policy priorities and community interests unique to each of these regions. So for us to understand the end users, what they need, the requirements, will be a really key piece in making sure that this work is really useful. Understanding the state needs, resources, capacities, mandates can all help inform this work. So the needs identified in the ocean acidification hypoxia action plans will provide a starting place for this. So again, while we're currently focusing on state level actions, we do realize that there is a breadth of potential actions, and then this is our thinking so far and is not exhaustive. So we look forward to augmenting our current thinking with other decision points that we should be thinking about, considering, and aware of. So now we'll dive a little bit more into some of the specifics of these, each of these states and how we envision this project informing these processes. And then finally, we'll explain our intention to develop the 2 workshops that I mentioned at the beginning, one kickoff and one concluding, and the engagement throughout the duration of the project. So in California, the efforts of the panels that I mentioned previously elevated and brought significant attention to and policy action to ocean acidification along the California coast, spurring legislation in California to address greenhouse gas emissions and ocean acidification, established the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Task Force and the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Reduction Program. And altogether, these efforts have provided a framework for addressing knowledge gaps. As Tessa mentioned, that there still are many knowledge gaps, mitigation strategies, and coastal conservation in California. All of this work has resulted in funding for multiple ocean acidification-related projects funded through the Ocean Protection Council, including the parallel effort, again, that Tessa mentioned earlier, to identify geographies of stress of ocean acidification. So then in 2018, the California state released the Ocean Acidification and Action Plan for California. And this action plan identifies 6 main strategies to prepare for the full range of OA risks and impacts, to activate responsible elements of state government, reduce the pollution that causes ocean acidification, deploy living systems to slow OA and store carbon, build resilience of affected communities, industries, and interests, and lastly, engage beyond state boundaries. And each of these strategies consists of several actions within. And these strategies necessitate engagement from a variety of entities, including some of the ones I mentioned earlier, living resource managers, policymakers, water quality, industry. And so this is the momentum that has been building in California, and I will now turn it over to Anna to talk a little bit more about Oregon and Washington.
Thanks, Jess and Tessa. So as Jess was mentioning, specific actions or the California Action Plan, Oregon has also followed a similar path. Efforts to address ocean acidification impacts emerged initially in response to the 2007 Whiskey Creek hatchery failure. And following the third Oregon Climate Assessment Report that identified ocean acidification and hypoxia as a major issue facing Oregonians, the Oregon Coordinating Council on Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia was established in 2017 through Senate Bill 1039 with the goal of coordinating ocean acidification and hypoxia related activities. So at that moment, things really ramped up in the state. And membership of the council, importantly, is quite inclusive, representing different interests and levels of action, so including state agencies, researchers, as well as tribal governments. The OAH Council produced a report in 2018, and we were really excited to see that in early June of this year, the council released the first Oregon OAH Action Plan, which is currently available for comment until July 9th. So visit the website and take a look at that. The main themes of the plan, so following the initial report in 2018, similar to California's, are to invest in Oregon's monitoring network to document oceanography and biology as it relates to Oregon's vulnerabilities to ocean acidification and hypoxia. So you can imagine some of those actions are quite relevant to the work we're doing. Develop and integrate strategies to reduce the causes of excess CO2 and to also reduce other drivers of ocean acidification and hypoxia. The third theme is to support activities and initiatives that will promote adaptation and resilience in Oregon's human communities as well as natural ecosystems. Fourth is to communicate ocean acidification and hypoxia science, the impacts, and some proposed solutions in order to raise awareness and support these decision-making actions. So again, a lot of the work that we're doing for this project. And finally, is to mobilize agencies to address ocean acidification and hypoxia priorities. It's really important to also note that the council has played a key role in coordinating efforts across these state agencies, as well as within the state agencies and the governor's office, as well as federal and regional entities. So again, although it's an Oregon Action Plan, it's clearly integrated into a wider regional and national effort. Moving on to Washington, specifically in 2017, the Marine Resources Advisory Council, MRAC, convened Washington's leading ocean acidification thinkers to evaluate progress, next steps, as well as some revisions to recommended actions that were identified from the 2012 Blue Ribbon Panel. The 2017 report updated the comprehensive strategy, again, based on emerging science, management, and this global network of partners that were working on the challenges of ocean acidification. So similar to the other two plans in this neighboring West Coast states, actions to address ocean acidification include these broad focus areas, including reducing carbon emissions, reducing local land-based contributions to ocean acidification, increasing the ability to adapt to and remediate the impacts, investing in monitoring, and informing, educating, and engaging stakeholders, including the public as well as decision makers. And lastly, maintaining a sustainable and coordinated focus on ocean acidification. Particularly for the case of Washington, industry members have been really active in building partnerships with scientists and driving action as part of one of the key recommendations of the Washington Blue Ribbon Panel. So after highlighting these three pretty exciting action plans, we also want to note that we may have missed some events or milestones, and also that we are more familiar with California and Oregon, and we're really excited and looking forward to building these milestones out and identifying better important decision-making points at which the research can really sort of take off and contribute to specific actions. And we're going to be doing that through the feedback that we hope to receive from this webinar, as well as through the workshop that Jess will be describing shortly. Across all states, we also want to recognize that these decision-making processes and frameworks are all relatively new, right? You can kind of see how things really ramped up since 2016. So evidence suggests that while we work closely with state agencies in marine and coastal jurisdictions, we also think it's reasonable to explore ways to expand these key decision-making scenarios to include agencies with more land-based jurisdictions in these conversations. We're also well aware of the federal attention and momentum building around OA action. So while we're currently more focused on the West Coast states because of this heightened activity related to OA, we're aware that there are places where this work will be useful at other levels of government, and we welcome feedback at those levels as well. And finally, it's worth noting that a lot of this lead-up work in the states was made possible by collaborations across states as a result of support from organizations like the Pacific Coast Collaborative and the International Alliance in OA. And we encourage ways to engage these organizations that work across the landscapes and geographies that were discussed. So the questions are, how are we going to build on this momentum in this project? And I will turn it back to Jess to describe some of the specific activities we're planning for the next steps.
Great, thanks, Anna. So to do all of this and engage potential end users, as I alluded to before, we plan to hold workshops that bookend the project. So one kind of kickoff launch workshop at the beginning, one concluding workshop at the end, and then with engagement where appropriate throughout, as we believe that waiting solely until the end of the research project to discuss and share results would unnecessarily limit the value of this project and this research. So our intention is to first solicit information during kind of our initial scoping of this first workshop, and then share progress about and have sustained conversations with decision makers along the way to be nimble as the decision-making landscape evolves, and it might change over the course of the 3 years of this research project. So we're viewing this webinar and the resulting recording to serve as kind of that initial step of this engagement, as well as the distribution list that Emily mentioned at the beginning that you can sign up for to stay informed, and we'll touch on that in a minute. So we will begin by collaboratively planning and convening this workshop at the outset, and this will bring together project researchers, industry, resource managers, policy stakeholders from the 3 West Coast states to help inform research outputs to be relevant to imminent natural resource management and policy decisions, and to ensure that the research trajectory throughout the 3-year project aligns with decision maker needs and links the results to those decisions. So throughout the course of this project, we will continue to connect with decision makers and stakeholders to ensure that, this research trajectory remains aligned with those decision needs. We would like to identify opportunities to use early results in ongoing policy and management dialogues, if so fits, through this likely shifting landscape. So continuing to have those conversations throughout so that we're aware of things as they pop up. And so similar to the kickoff workshop, we will then hold a concluding workshop at the culmination of the project, and we will collaborate to convene that workshop to share research findings and facilitate the uptake and use of the research outputs. And our vision for this latter meeting is that we can help identify ways that our results will be used to shape and prioritize research and science investments in the future, management decisions, and potential stakeholder engagement moving forward. So a little bit more about this first workshop. We are in the initial scoping phase, and it will be held at the end of August. And the goal of this workshop will be to discuss the research objectives of the project, identify any potential additional data sets that, Tessa was going through some of the types of data that they're thinking about, if there are any additional data sets that might be useful to synthesize through this effort, and learn about the concerns and opportunities for managers and decision makers to use the outcomes of this work. So specific outcomes that we expect from this workshop would be the considerations for research to better align with the decision-making needs. So are there things that need to be tweaked or modified slightly so that we make sure that this work is aligning with the needs of the end users. Defining where the key decision points are on the landscape within and across states and at other levels. So we want to really understand where those upcoming management and policy opportunities and decision timelines are. And then to help identify an engagement strategy throughout the duration of the project. Building off of feedback we received from today, we want to set the stage for regular interaction between the scientific team and those interested in the outcomes of this project. So we hope to design the workshop and the agenda and process in a way to ensure that it's most useful and that there's uptake and follow-up and establishing points of contact for continued collaboration during the project. So like I mentioned, while we're at the beginning stages of this workshop planning and in the information gathering stage, we hope to hone in on the scope and participants and goals and want to ensure that we've looked across the landscape, and again, for that, we would appreciate your input. So while we're trying to keep this workshop around the smaller size of about 20 to 25 to make sure we're having a really fruitful discussion and conversation, we want to expand our understanding of what decision points we should be considering for this work. So things like, funding allocation for adaptation or mitigation projects, where ocean acidification and hypoxia may be considered in fisheries management decisions, or informing further policy frameworks or legislative action. So we've started initial conversations and look forward to continuing and building upon those conversations as we work to plan this workshop. And as we mentioned, in addition to the workshop itself, there will be other ways to stay engaged and informed throughout the project. Maybe workshop summaries or project progress that will be shared via the distribution list. And we're thinking about landing places and how this can be really helpful. We're thinking about that early on, but recognize that, as I said, this is kind of potentially a moving target and work in progress. And so there will be likely places where decision points shift throughout or we become aware of new things, and our goal is just to best align this work with the needs for the science resulting. So for, again, feedback and engagement, what would be really helpful for us is to help inform our information gathering. We would really appreciate hearing from all of you who you would recommend that we engage with to continue expanding our understanding of the decision landscape around these changing ocean conditions along the West Coast. And are there any additional relevant processes, decision points, or timelines that we should be aware of as we continue through this project. And so to collect this information and feedback from all of you, it will help us identify and prioritize engagement opportunities as the project progresses. And to do so, we have a survey that Emily, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, will be sharing out the link via email following the webinar, as well as, again, the instructions to join the distribution list. And so, again, our intention is to be sharing about the progress and having sustained conversations with decision makers along the way. So please also reach out if you have any questions. And so with that, here are all three of our email addresses. Emily gave her email address up at the front, and I will turn it back over to you, Emily.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica.
And I'm just trying to stop sharing my screen.
All right. Okay, I got it now. Okay, I'm going to pull this up. Okay, everybody, thank you guys so much for that great presentation. We're going to move into questions and answers now. So I will, if you have a question, a reminder to type it into the Q&A panel, and we will read it out for the researchers. So the first question we have, or sort of a comment really, is, and research team, please respond if you have some thoughts about this, but suggest considering oysters and oyster seed. Do you guys have any reactions? People muted.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry. I'm wondering, like, are people muted?
I was trying to answer and I was muted. Yes, thank you, Diane, for that question. So I sort of briefly mentioned this at the beginning, but I was sort of stumbling over it because I was trying to also watch the chat questions come through at the same time. So that's a lesson in not multitasking. But there is a linked project to this one, which is supported by the California Ocean Protection Council, which is more focused on estuarine species. And so when we're thinking about species like oysters, it will probably be done, as part of that project, as well as some of the collaborators that we mentioned in Washington and Oregon are also working on oysters. And so oysters are on the forefront of our mind as well. This project, supported by Lenfest Ocean Program, is more focused on open coast species.
Great, thank you so much for that. And just another comment from Diane, the Pacific Shellfish Institute may be helpful, and the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. And some of those folks might actually be on the line. They were invited. Thank you for that comment. We're taking that down, as well as a few other folks that have chatted some ideas at us, and we are recording it all and we'll be providing it to the research team. So our next question is, are you open to working with other areas of the world like Southeast Asia?
This is Tessa. Should I take that again? I mean, I think we're open to working in a variety of different places, but we did choose the West Coast as a starting place for this project because of that, sort of those 2 points I made at the beginning, the really interesting oceanographic landscape that aligns with a decision-making landscape where people are sort of ready and interested in uptaking this information into management decisions. And so I certainly think that model could be used in a variety of different places around the world where there is a combination of enough scientific information and a decision-making landscape where people are ready for it. Jess and Anna might want to add a little bit to that.
Thank you, Tessa. I would echo what you just mentioned. I see the opportunities in exploring how research are directly linked to what we call policy windows is a model that can certainly be replicated elsewhere, and I'm certainly open to exploring that in other areas. So I do similar work related to fisheries and linking fisheries and communities and technology, so there's no reason why a model like this would not be able to be used elsewhere.
Great, thanks guys. And I'll just say from the Lenfest perspective on that, as results come out of this project, if it yields lessons that other areas might be interested in, we'll be sure to share the information and reach out. Another question, are you utilizing AI to process all the massive amounts of data during your synthesis?
This is Tessa. I'll take that one. We are not. We actually have some other projects that are also very data rich at the moment, and in fact, our postdoc Aurora Reichert is on the call listening in, and she has been leading an effort to work with another project with tons of oceanographic data, and so we've been thinking about this a lot. And actually, what we worry about more in a lot of ways is data gaps, because a lot of these data sets you would think are data rich, but they are spotty at times. And so we've been, brainstorming and thinking as a team about how we're going to need to make decisions about interpolating in places where there are not data. So in some cases, we're actually more concerned about that than there being too much data.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tessa. We have another question here. There is growing interest in pursuing offshore shellfish aquaculture, including oysters and seaweeds.
Yeah, so this ties to the previous question. I think that's great. I mean, in that case, the outcomes of this in terms of the geospatial maps will be very relevant for those kinds of decisions.
We got a question here from George Leonard from Ocean Conservancy. Hi, George. How much is this about OA versus other changing ocean conditions like temperature and dissolved oxygen in particular? It seems like the policy side is really OA focused, but not quite clear how multi-stressor the data sets are.
Great question. So I'm going to suggest that Anna and Jess maybe address that on the policy side first, and then I'll contribute an answer on the data side.
Yeah, so I'll take that to start. This is Jess. So while we're kind of, as a starting place, definitely focused on the OA side of the policy with the OA action plans, it is worth noting that Oregon's is an ocean acidification and hypoxia action plan, so it's not limited to just ocean acidification, and that those are really just starting places for us, and that one of the places that we would really appreciate feedback is, to consider if there are other decision points on the landscape that we should be considering in addition to, just ocean acidification, where feasible for this work to slot in and help.
Anything to add, Anna?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, again, for Oregon specifically, the action plans do call for reducing other causes of ocean acidification and hypoxia. So in that respect, I would argue that it is open to other potential stresses that sort of multiply the effect of ocean acidification, for instance. And Tessa, I'm sure, can speak to the data sets.
Yeah, so thank you for this question, George. It's a sort of practical reality that we have to deal with in thinking about these data. There are a lot of temperature data sets, and they extend much further back in time than data sets for hypoxia or acidification. And so the real question will be how we can layer the other stressors on top of temperature. And so based on what I've seen of those sort of monitoring inventories, sort of the next richest data set will be around pH and ocean acidification, or CO2. And then depending on where you are along the coast, there are places where there's a lot of data around hypoxia and places where there aren't. And so I think, the degree, we would like to make it as multi-stressor as possible, and actually would be happy to include things like salinity and chlorophyll or nutrients as well, but it's actually going to be limited by where people are measuring those data sort of over the spatial and temporal scales that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you for that answer, and thank you for that question. So we have another question here. Are you going to be encouraging the deployment of additional data collection tech in water? If so, what tech sensors are you proposing to deploy? In this project, they won't be deploying sensors, but I will let perhaps you, Tessa, talk if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's probably the answer I would have given. I mean, that's not part of this project. This project is built upon the idea that there's actually a lot of available data that could be used to sort of stitch together and think about the complexity of the oceanography along this coast. Of course, as a research team, we are strong advocates for the importance of having sensors in the water, and we speak about that a lot. And we really, I often say to people, where would we be right now if we didn't have things like the Keeling curve or sensors in the water? We really need monitoring and long-term investigations, and so we certainly support that in other ways, but it's not a part of this data synthesis effort.
Well, thank you for that. We have just a few minutes left and a lot of questions, so this is great. Thank you, folks. We will keep going right until 2 o'clock, but we will get all the questions down and share them with the researchers, even the ones we can't get to. So, or 3 o'clock, I should say. I don't even know what time it is. Okay, here's a question. Any cooperation or communication with OA researchers and decision makers on the East Coast?
Yeah, actually, Emily, I might let you take the decision-making piece on that, and maybe Anna and Jess can chime in. But I can say from the oceanographic piece, there's a lot of cooperation and communication within researchers in this field. And so, yes, I would say, we are, actively in touch with researchers on the East Coast that, might have equivalent projects that they are ramping up, and also there's a lot of coordination between the ocean observing systems. And so I think people really are thinking about these processes as impacting various coastlines and are moving those projects forward appropriately.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa. And I will just add into that. Yeah, here at Lenfest, we've started with really thinking about identifying federal audiences, especially right here in Washington, D.C., at NOAA, as well as EPA and other agencies, as well as in Congress. So we're kind of starting there. But then as the project gets going, we definitely want to think about who in East Coast states are working on this issue and where can there be crosstalk where, states or the two coasts can kind of learn from each other. So that is very much on our radar, thinking about what Tessa and her team learn from this, where that could be relevant, at least these methods could be relevant in other places, particularly on the East Coast, because there's a lot happening on this side too. So I am going to ask just one more question, and here we have one. What would be the easiest pathway for shellfish growers to pursue developing monitoring capacity at their facilities if they don't currently have any?
This is Tessa. I would say, collaboration with NOAA and IUCE is probably the easiest pathway in terms of connecting with groups that are already putting a lot of sensors in the water and and working between aquaculture and scientific groups.
Cool. Does anybody have anything else to add? Otherwise, we will conclude the webinar. Yeah, I'll pause there for a second in case Jess and Anna have anything else they'd like to say.
Thank you so much for everybody for listening in.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing feedback and further questions and suggestions.
Yeah, just echoing all of that, just thank you for everybody's participation in the webinar so far, and we look forward to continuing to engage.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Like we all said, this is just getting going, and we're looking forward to working with many folks over the next couple of years. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to join the distribution. And with that, thank you very much. We're done.